Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Michelle Oldfield. I'm with the Julian Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. It is my honor to introduce our moderator, Amanda Ellis. Amanda currently serves as Executive Director, Asia Pacific for the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation and Senior Director for Global Partnerships and Networks for the Julian Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. She's co-chair of the We Empower UN SDG Challenge, launched by the UN Secretary General, President of the World Bank, and Council of the Women World Leaders in 2018 to promote inclusive entrepreneurship. Amanda also served as ambassador to the United Nations and served on the United Nations Security Council as co-chair for the high-level humanitarian access to Syria, was deputy secretary in the New Zealand Foreign Ministry, an economist at the World Bank, and the first woman to lead the New Zealand International Development Assistance Agency. Amanda, take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I could not be more excited by our guest today, Steve Killalay, who is the founder and chair of the internationally renowned global think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace, which has created the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index. I have been a fan of Steve's right back since my time as an economist at the World Bank, when I started studying his work. And he has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. And I'm holding up his wonderful book. You can see it's well read. John Lord Allardyce says, Steve has contributed more to understanding and addressing conflict than many Nobel Peace Laureates. This powerful, accessible, and insightful book shows how. And indeed, Steve's business acumen and his experience as founder of two publicly listed companies have really been brought to bear in the analysis that he focuses on. He is a philanthropist, and his family foundation has helped 3.6 million direct beneficiaries. So it's wonderful for me to see that his aim of moving peace to center stage, grounded in economics, is so accessible in his book. And of course, with the war in Ukraine, this could not be a more timely webinar. Steve, so delighted to have you here and to hear from you.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Amanda, and it's really my pleasure to be here. So what I've got is a very fast moving presentation, probably take half an hour, maybe 35 minutes. What I'm going to do now is share my screen. I'll just throw it up. And the presentation's around the book. A lot of it will be about my actual personal journey, what I've learned along the way, and an entrepreneurial story about how do you create a global think tank. So without more ado, let's see if we can get this all shared and right. Now, can everyone see that? Can I get a comment
yes, looking
back?
Good.
Okay, great. All right, we're away. Okay, so Peace in the Age of Chaos covers a number of different themes. It's my personal journey to peace. Also talk about why this book's important and the entrepreneurial story. And I think that's probably the most interesting part, to be honest. Come back to the concept of positive peace, what it is, systems, because really societies operate as systems. We all say it and we all think we understand it, but actually we don't understand systems really well. While positive peace, and combined with systems, provides a transformational concept for change, and particularly when we're looking at the Western democracies, as they're starting to, what I'd call them squeaky wheels. They're fraying around the edges and they need to be reinvigorated. So now, as Amanda said in the introduction, my background's in business, set up two international IT companies, and from that made quite a lot of money. And so then I set up a family foundation, and that family foundation now has done over 220 projects around the world. Average project runs for about 3 years. And the average expenditure is about $100,000 per project per annum. That's US dollars. So now at this stage, we've got about 3.6 million direct beneficiaries. But in my journey to peace, I'll just cover a few of the different projects we've done and what I learned from them. So this shot's taken of a refugee camp in northern Uganda. What happened there is we were funding a project up there which worked on the rehabilitation of child soldiers captured by the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA. It's probably the most brutal organisation I've come across in my life, much worse than Islamic State. So what they do is 80% of the kids they capture were boys. They usually like to get them in the age bracket of 8 to 10. 20% were girls. They were only in the 14 to 16 age bracket. So they took them back to their base camp. If any of them were slow, if any of them complained or any of them cried, they'd kill them. And the way they'd kill them is they get the kids they captured to beat them to death, and they'd stand over beating those kids so that they wouldn't stop. So that was the initiation into the LRA. And then within a year, they'd get them to raid the villages they'd captured them from, and then killing someone in the village, and sometimes their own parents. And that was simply to cut off an escape route. And that way, sort of, they were then, the LRA was their family. And so, like, some of the stories which came out of some of the kids I spoke to, they're horrific. Like, I can't describe it. But if we look at this camp here probably held about 10,000 people. If you look in it, you can see down the far left-hand corner a market. And that was the market for the 10,000 people. Each of those huts contained 6 to 8 people. So I'll give you an idea of just what a real refugee camp in Africa can look like. This child here that came out of the same project, don't know his name, don't know when he was born. He was caught in a firefight with the mother. She had him strapped to the back in a firefight with the Ugandan army and dropped him on the battlefield. Got picked up and then got down to the premises where we were doing the rehabilitation on the child soldiers. Now, this shot here comes out of the Maasai. It's shot up in Tanzania. We did a project there with the Maasai. And so you can see this kid here, he might be 8 years old. And at that age, he's responsible for all those cows you can see in front of him. And that's and for the Maasai, that's their wealth kept in the cows. So at a very, very young age, these kids get quite strong responsibilities. So what we did, this mount called Mount Meru, which I would never heard of. It lies about 40 kilometres, 50 kilometres from Kilimanjaro, and it's about 100 metres shorter than Kilimanjaro. So it's a big mountain. There's a rain shadow on it. So what we did is we took, and 20,000 Maasai live in that rain shadow. So what we did is we took water and took it from the rain side of the mountain, put it down into the rain shadow to sort of provide water for the people and also for the cattle as well. And so that was quite a transformational project. Like what I realised then is sort of just that water, just how precious water is. And as we look at Africa today, one of its major issues is its lack of water. But what I should say is the lack of capture of water. The water's there in the wet season, but it's not adequately captured to use through the dry season. This is one of my favourites. This is the monk up in Mandalay in Burma. So and so what happened is he provides free education for 10,000 kids. And so first thing we did was we built him a school block so he could take more kids. And then we're sort of taken over supporting the running of the school. But the running of the school for 10,000 kids is something like about $70,000 to $80,000 a year. It's not much. So he had a friend from the Kirin state who said, well, look, we've got a civil war going on up here. We've got all these kids. They get pressed into the Kirin civil militia, or they get pressed into the Burmese army, but none of them have got any school. So the monk said, the monk's name's Unayakar, said, okay, well, look, I can get them down to the school, give them plenty of education. I've also got room, some accommodation there I can put them in. And that accommodation is what you can see in the back. He says, but I haven't got any money to feed them. So what he did is he took them in as novice monks. And then in the traditional style of Burma, they could go out with their begging bowls and get their food each morning along with all the other monks. And that's an example of the entrepreneurship in a very, very different culture than ours. This guy here, this was right on the border of Burundi and the Congo. And so we'd literally been driving for half an hour. We hadn't seen another town or even a little village. And I saw this guy pushing this sack of wheat up a hill, or some sort of grain anyway, up a hill, heading back to the town we'd probably come through to sell it. And it just struck me how tough a lot of these lives are. And give you an idea of just what innovation does. So when the mobile phone arrived in Africa, this guy then would be able to go to someone in the village who'd had a mobile phone, and then they'd be able to send a message to the villagers in either direction to find out where he get the best price for his grain. And so before that, he'd just take off on the hope that he got to the village with the right grain. He wouldn't be able to negotiate the price beforehand, but that's just an example of how innovation can make massive differences to someone with a very, very poor and a very, very tough life. This is the face of poverty. This came out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So we did a project where it was a child survival project. So if you note, you can see a hernia hanging out of this little boy's stomach. So now they were so poor that they weren't getting enough nutrition. The stomach muscles had ruptured, creating those hernias. You'd only see it with the boys, never saw it with the girls. And so we could always do an operation to sew the stomach muscles back up, but it wouldn't do any good because they'd fracture and go again because of the lack of nutrients. We spent maybe $1 million. No, it's more than that. I think it was something like $3 to $5 million we spent in this area, and we couldn't see it make any difference. So like that, this is really the face of poverty. So we come over here, we're moving over to Kenya now, and this is out in the semi-nomadic areas of Kenya. And this is so in this area, they've got the highest trachoma rate in the world. Trachoma is where it's a disease of the eye. It comes about through quite often lack of water and dust. What it does is the eyelids turn in and they scratch the eye away until you go blind, incredibly painful. So we did a project to take some medicines, and they're just really a simple substance which you just rub into the eyes to get to and that then gets rid of the trachoma. But all these people were nomadics. So what we had to do is, all the people who were doing the project, what they'd do is they'd go out and they'd just follow and try and track down the tribes. When they track them down, then they could give them the ointment, and then over time it gets rid of the trachoma. So these are some of the kids, and so what you can see in the background there is what they live in. And these things they put together, throw on the back of their camels, and will move on to the next place as they move with all their animals. So it's a very, very different world. So, all right, now let's move around and get into an entrepreneurial story on the building a think tank. So one of the things which comes out of systems is this concept of path dependencies. All cultures are on a journey, and the journey's been set by their history. It'll be their values, it'll be what's going on, it's the structure of the systems. And we're all a little bit like that. Our lives are path dependent. They're dependent on where we come from. They're dependent on what we're around. And our agency is a lot less than what we think when we really sit down and think about it. And we do have agency, but the language I'm using now is not because I learned English. It's because my mother taught me English, because that was her native tongue. And I'm not sitting here because I decided to sit here and talk to you. I'm sitting here because of a whole myriad of other people who've created other inventions which are now put into technology, which means I've got Zoom and a computer here to be able to talk to you. So as we start to think of the systems in which we're dependent, our lives are always dependent on that path. So like now, what started the journey on this was a question, a simple question. I was in the DRC in the Congo, northeast Kivu to be precise. It's one of the more violent places in the world. I just thought, what are the most peaceful nations in the world? And was there anything I could learn to bring into the projects I was doing? It was a fantasy question. Searched the internet when I got back to Sydney, couldn't find anything, and that's how the Global Peace Index was born. But that poses a really simple question, or really quite a profound question. Because if a simple businessman like me can be walking through Africa and wonder what are the most peaceful nations in the world, and hasn't been done, how much do we know about peace? You can't measure something. Can you truly understand it? If you can't measure it, how do you even know whether your actions are helping you or hindering you in what you're doing? You simply don't. So at that point, then I started to network the idea extensively. And so I went round to 7 or 8 different peace institutes and said, well, do you think the index which measured the peacefulness of the world was a good idea and whether you're doing it? And they all said, yeah, great idea, we're not doing it. So what I did then is I had a guy working for me who used to run the Economist Intelligence Unit in London, which is the research arm of the Economist Group. And so then what I did was decided to use them to develop the index. And they had one of the better reputations in the world for developing indexes at the time. And that meant I could really, really, really leverage that brand name for credibility, because when you're doing something new, getting credibility is exceptionally different. And sort of, look, I've done this and we're getting towards the end of the index. I thought, well, gee, this is a pretty good idea. If I do it, what's the point of just sitting on it? Maybe I should hire a PR company and promote it. So I then hired a PR company in London. And the first launch was massively successful. We had over 1 billion media impressions, which at the time really blew me away. But what you're seeing here is you're just seeing a story which starts with a question, decide to do something, and now I'm building on it. And that quite often is an entrepreneurial process. You don't start with a strategy to go somewhere. You start with an idea, and then it sort of has its own path dependency. It's got its own journey. And you as the entrepreneur follow it. And I guess one of the key things is, one of the things I've always been able to do is find the white space on the canvas. And what I could see the gap with peace, because a lot of it was very morally based, which is great. But a lot of people saw peace as being something nice to aspire to, but highly impractical. So the gap for me, what I could see was the use of mass statistics, and then the combination of sort of the money. What is the value of peace? And that's the Institute for Economics and Peace. And you can see for its name, that's where it focused. So now, new ideas are quite often very, very fragile and require nurturing. It's much like a baby. And so once the idea is grown up and it becomes adolescence, then it can be really robust and stand up to criticism. So all too often in life, what you'll find is people can have a great idea, and as soon as they share it, everyone comes out with why it won't work. So for a new idea, the best thing you can do is work out why it will work, okay? And obviously you've got to be somewhat critical, but build it up. Once you build it up, then you'll be in a position to be able to robustly attack it. So with this, I would strongly advise not to use the word peace, particularly in Washington, because peace was associated with stuff which was pretty impractical in nature. It was associated with the people who didn't like government much, didn't like the military. A lot of them were anti-globalization, anti-business. But I stuck with the word, and I was advised to use the security instead, and created a human security index. But the word peace for me was integral. And so we look at it now, peace is used everywhere. And I think the work we did partly sprung around that feeling of peace. Now, I was 2 years into the project before I actually even created the Institute for Economics and Peace, but you've got to understand this started off just as a question. I thought I'd do an index, and having done an index, I thought publicize it a bit. Then I was going to put it into a university, but each time I'd go and interview a university and then give them $250,000 a year for it. But each time I go along to a university, I couldn't see the dynamism, which would take it anyway. They all wanted to do it, but I think it just languished. This AEE research project, I couldn't see how they'd make the impact. It was 2 years later I realised that, well, maybe I should create a think tank around this. And that's where the Institute for Economics and Peace came in. So never realised this, and this is back to this concept of path dependency. So I never realised this till I was 7 or 8 years into the into the Institute for Economics and Peace. So I copied the very processes I'd used to create computer products. So we'd have releases, annual releases. And what we'd do then is we'd update them each year. And the idea originally was get I guess what you call a minimal viable product, which was the first global peace index, get it onto the market, see how it go. And then you'd expand the body of research each year as you went along. And then what that meant is over a period of time, and now it's 17 years, we've got a really deep set of knowledge around peace. And so it's concepts of incremental development and also the concepts of marketing. So it's coming out of a background, computer products background, marketing's really key. And the other thing built into it, and that's like taking a PR company, that concept of marketing is really built in. The other thing, it's the same as sort of the companies I built, they continually travel the world. So when I built my computer companies, quite often, this is in the days before the internet, I'd get on a plane and I'd spend 5 weeks hitting a new city every 2 days to sell the computer software we had. And then I'd continuously do that. So I'd come back to Australia maybe for 2 months and I'd be off on another 3 to 5 week trip around the world. And so if you're going to develop anything which is global in nature, you really need to be able to put the energy and effort into doing it. So that brings us around to hard work. Never underestimate the power of hard work and obsessive thinking. So if you've got a revolutionary idea or a new idea, not many people are actually going to understand it. So if you like, you can use a model, and this is just a heuristic if you like to think with, but it's sort of stood me fairly well through the years. So about 1% of the world's really innovators, about another 10% or say are early adopters. Then you come down to another 30%, which are followers, and the rest you could call laggards. If you've got a really good idea, those innovators will be able to pick up with it, think about it, run with it. The early adopters don't need to see much. They understand it and they go. The next group, which we call the followers, and that's the people who can actually see something working. They can understand it, now want to adopt it and take it on. Now, those followers, that's where you'll find most of your CEOs, you'll find most of your board directors, most of the people in government, and that's really good. And that's probably appropriate and right because they don't take too many risks. They want to see things which are working. But if you've got an idea which is really good, don't expect other people to really understand it. Seek out those early adopters or the visionaries, build your ideas up with that and move on from there. So in a sales process, if I went into a company, I did this with the Institute for Economics and Peace, I'd seek out the people who really understood what I was doing and work with them. Quite often that meant staying away from people with necessarily a lot of power because they fitted in to that category of followers, and quite rightly so. So if we take peace, one of the big things for me was moving peace from moral condition to something empirical. And that really involved taking peace and moving it to the middle ground. And to do that, one had to make it really relevant to business. And that's why the economics came into it and also measurement. So in the world of business, people are very, very much moved by sort of concepts of metrics and money. and also by the concept of money and the way it relates. Now, one of the other things which happened, what I realised is most of the time when we're studying peace, we're actually studying conflict. And the study of peace is very, very different. And that's best explained through an analogy. So if you think about, let's say, health, great breakthroughs in the 50s and since with pathology. None of us are going to die of a heart attack young. We're curing cancer. It's great. But it wasn't until we started to study healthy people, we knew what was needed to stay healthy and not get sick in the first place. Right exercise, correct mental disposition, plenty of exercise. You're not going to learn anything of those things through studying someone on their deathbed. And peace is pretty much the same. If you want a resilient peace, what you need to create it is very much different than what you need to do to actually stop conflict. I think finally, as we're moving through the research, we suddenly, not suddenly, but it dawned on us that it's all about systems, something society, and it's something we know very, very little about. There aren't any adequate frameworks today to really analyse a society from a systems perspective. And also, we've got nothing. No government I know of really looks at the societal issues to try and run the governments which they've got. So I'm going to skip this one because of the fullness of time. So we come up today. This is the products which we've forgot. So it's not all of them. So as you can see, what started with one up in the top right-hand corner, the Global Peace Index, expanded out into a whole series of different products. And so today, as we're sitting here, or as we will, not so much as we're sitting here, last year we had 28 billion media impressions from about 14,000 different news articles and about 1.8 billion social media impressions. So we've now got peace academies where people can train online. We've got ambassadors. We've trained over 4,000 ambassadors, put out a number of reports. We put out a news feed once a week called Future Trends. So that's got about 40,000 subscribers, which looks at what's happened in the last week in the news, which gives you an insight into where the future may be going. And we've also done a lot of work on the relationship between business and peace. And there's more. That's just what I could fit on one slide. So, okay, let's move to some of the research now. Try and fasten this up and move through this really quite quickly and try and aim at being done in about 10, possibly 15 minutes at the most. So if we go back over the last decade, well, what we find is that the peace declined by 2%. Okay, so we're a lot less peaceful, but more countries became more peaceful than deteriorated. In fact, 86 became more peaceful while 75 deteriorated. And what we can see from that is that it's a lot easier to fall in peace than it is to increase in peace. Building peace takes time. And one of the things over this period of time, is a fascinating graph, because we've got this growing global inequality in peace. The most peaceful countries become marginally more peaceful by about 4.5%, while the least peaceful countries have become far less peaceful by about 12%. And so you can see this growing inequality in peace. Now, the Global Peace Index divided up into 3 different domains. So I'll just step through quickly them to give you an idea of how they're performing over time. Just pick a few indicators. So this is violent demonstration. So violent demonstrations are on the increase. This is the average of all the countries in the world. But if we looked at the total count of violent demonstrations, they're increasing by 10% per annum over the last decade, and it's just keeping on going. Forcibly displaced people, you can see that the number of people displaced is just keeping on climbing, and with the Ukrainian crisis now, it's only going to go further up. But what we can see, there's a global trend on reductions in homicides. That's happening everywhere around the globe. If we start to look at conflict, we can find that battlefield deaths actually peaked in about 2013, and that was the height of the war against Islamic State. It's been improving since. This only goes as far as 2019. But what we'll find is that now with the Ukraine, that's going to be moving back up, and the Ukraine puts us in a whole new area. Now, while this was going on, buddy, while battlefield deaths are declining, total number of conflicts are increasing, but they're very, very low level ones. But also, along with that total number of conflicts increasing, so is the intensity of them, although they're very, very low levels compared to, let's say, the wars in Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan. And I guess that's the backdrop to the world which we live today. And the latest one is the Ukraine. Now, this is a little bit out of date, but what we found is that the rates for the rates of militarization actually were improving up to about 2015. And that 2017. And that's around the time of the first issues with the Ukraine. And this is military expenditure, but it's based on the average expenditure per country. If we looked at military expenditure since 2015, because a lot of it's gone into just a few countries, but military expenditure since about 2015, as a percentage of global GDP, is rising faster than global GDP. But over that time, more countries were actually decreasing the military expenditure than increasing, but the ones which were increasing were big countries who were spending a lot. Now, we also put out a product called an ecological threat report each year, and it looks at the state of the world and looks at it through the lenses of ecology. And so what we find is there's this vicious cycle associated with ecological damage and conflict. So if you can imagine an environment gets degraded, that leads to conflict. The conflict itself degrades the environment even further. So you've got this vicious cycle. Now, you might get the rains come, you might get a peace deal done, and so you can get a let up in the conflict. But once the thing gets stressed again, the old fault lines come back and you find things fall in those fault lines. So ecological damage is a major driver of stress. And just give you an idea. So if we look at the ecological threat index and we look at the score there, 11 of the 15 countries with the worst scores are actually currently in conflict. And then what happens is we look at it, 3 of those other 4 countries are on our watch list to go in conflicts. So what you find is that it's a systemic issue. You've got malnutrition, you've got food insecurity, high population growth, very, very weak governance. And all of these come together in the countries which are most stressed ecologically. So it's a systemic problem. So to give you an idea, so Niger has got one of the highest, fastest, well, the Sahel's got this, the epicenter of global terrorism now, and it's got some of the highest population growth in the world. Niger's got the highest projected population growth to 2050, and that will increase 161%. So you put it into an area where there isn't enough water, there isn't enough food, you've got really weak governance, you've got Islamic militias, you can start to see the systemic nature of these problems. So now, if we look at it also, we look at the countries with the worst score on the ecological threat report. 28 of the 30 countries with the worst score are all in the bottom half of the Global Peace Index. Again, bringing back this relationship between resource degradation and conflict. And sub-Saharan Africa, which has the most countries at risk, far more than anywhere else in the world. So now, if we look at the resilience of countries, we combine it with their score, or their ecological score. The 30 countries with the lowest resilience and the worst scores are home to 1.26 billion people. And that's what we call hotspot countries. Now, just to drive this home further, just how bad it's getting. So if we look at it, and we went back for decades, what we've found, the number of undernourished people in the world have been steadily decreasing, but since 2017, it's been rising. Certainly, COVID has fueled it, made it worse, and we'll see the Ukrainian crisis, and we all see it with the increases in food prices. This is going to get much, much worse. One of the more fascinating things we've found with this is when we've looked at the thinness We use that as the measure of malnutrition for men or for males, and it's 3 times more prevalent than for females. And when I go back to all the developmental aid work, what I put that down to simply is that the women and girls are the ones who prepare the food. So therefore, while they're preparing it, much like I do at home if I was cooking a meal, you sample the goods. And I think simple things like that, but it's an area which is under study, and there's certainly a relationship between violence and the cognitive development. So if the brain doesn't develop, we've got a lot less control over our emotions. If you haven't got adequate food, how does that act as a motivator for people going and joining militias simply to get food? We don't understand enough about these kind of things. So let's come back to positive peace, attitude, institutions, and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. We arrive at it through using mathematical modelling and statistical analysis against the Global Peace Index. We use over 20,000, probably I think it's 26,000 indexes, attitudinal surveys and data points to arrive at it. And we take the ones which are most statistically associated with peace to understand what it is. The positive peace we can turn back into an index, and from that we find that positive peace creates higher per capita income, societies which are more resilient, have better environmental outcomes, higher measures of well-being and happiness, and perform better on a whole range of different developmental items. Therefore, positive peace in many ways describes an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. Now, if we go back and we look back over roughly the last decade, we can find that positive peace is improving, other than low levels of corruption. It's actually deteriorated, and we can see that well-functioning government hasn't really changed much either, nor has high levels of human capital. Now, certainly education's improved over those times. We're finding more people are getting educated in more parts of the world, but higher levels of human capital is more than just secondary school education. Now, these are the kind of factors which have changed globally. And so I used the example of the internet earlier on, but that's one of the things which is the access to the internet has improved greatly. So has inequality adjusted life expectancy, as has health overall, as has gender equality. Now we go down to the bottom, we find the quality of information's falling, fractionalized elites, that's where the elites within societies fight amongst themselves. We find that freedom of the press is dropping, and youth not in employment or education. And research and development, surprisingly, is falling off globally as well. So now just understand those red bars. We'll now move forward a bit. I'll move past that one for time. This is Europe. So you can see there's more red bars and more of them are stretched. And so you can find that this comes back to that Europe is performing under the average for positive peace globally over roughly the last decade. Now, have a look at the US, the changes in some of these percentages in the US. So what you find is the quality of information's down, fractionalized elites. You can see that through the fighting over your last election, government openness and transparency, group grievances, they're all in dire state. Now, having said that, the US also still has quite high positive peace. It ranked, I think, 28 on the positive peace index. So what's the dividend which comes from all of this? So if we look at the year this was done, cost of violence, the global economy was about $14 trillion. So that was about 11.5% of GDP, or about $1,895 for each person on the planet. Now, none of us can imagine a world which is going to be fully peaceful, but we can imagine a world which is 10% more peaceful. That's 1.4 trillion. That's the same as adding 3 new economies to the world the size of Ireland, Switzerland, and Denmark. Now, 1% of this figure, which is about 1.4 So it's about 140 billion. So 1% of this is the same amount of money which was spent on all overseas developmental aid in 2020, just to put it in perspective. I'll move past this one. Now, the economic argument piece is strong. So what we did is we took countries with the highest improvements in positive peace and compared it to the global average in terms of the growth of their economies. And that's measured through GDP. And what we found is the over a decade, the growth was 33% higher. That's huge amounts. But over the same period, we found that corporate profits grew 27% more. International trade growth was 30% more. And capital investment was 32% higher. So you can see as you improve the positive peace, it improves an underlying environment which is conducive to strong business. Now we're running out of time, but the empiricism, if we like, is built on cause and effect. That's great for studying the physical world, but it doesn't work with systems because the basis of empiricism is that the effect has no influence on the cause. And that's a bit like you throw a ball up in the air and you catch as it comes down. The advantage of that was it meant that we could actually study phenomena. You could create an experiment. Anyone could do the experiment and find that it works. But what we find with social experiments is only about 50% of them are replicable. And the reason for that is, then this is really simplistic, but the reason for that is in systems, the effect actually comes back and tries to change the cause. Think of two political parties maneuvering in an election. One makes a policy statement, the other one responds, and the first party now adjusts. And so society works like that all the time. So you get an outbreak of let's say a virus like COVID, you can see the society respond to come back and try and correct it. So that gets rid of the COVID and goes back to what it would see as a steady state. This can get incredibly, incredibly complex. So just the understanding of the philosophical differences between cause and effect and the way we run our societies compared to the way they actually operate, which is systemic. But I'm just going to give you one clear, simple example coming out of the positive peace. So 3 of the pillars: well-functioning government, low levels of corruption, free flow of information. Does well-functioning government affect the free flow of information, or does the free flow of information affect the way a government operates? Does corruption affect how a government operates, or does the government affect how corruption is carried out within the society? And similarly, does corruption now restrict the free flow of information, and does free flow of information shine light on corruption? You can't separate any of it. That's only 3 different blocks. So again, when you're looking at it, you have to come back and think about societies from a system. So in many ways, they're self-regulating. They do that through encoded norms. They're path dependent. The encoded norms that regulate the homeostasis of the system. So if something hits the system and it's out of bounds, it does an action to try and correct it. Systems are also self-modifying when there are persistent mismatches with the inputs and the way they're handled within the encoded norms. And they're cyclic. They form virtuous and vicious cycles. They're moving in a particular direction, and the processes will reinforce the direction in which they're heading. And you can understand it all through mathematics. So we've developed a process called HALO, and that's for analysing. This is the cutting edge of what we're doing at the moment, for analysing systems. And so what that does is it's a 28 process set of building blocks, which you can mix and match to analyse societal systems. And as near as I can make out, I think this is the most advanced practical framework I've seen for trying to understand societies, but this is all in its early days. So what I'm going to do now is stop the presentation, but I'll just finish with one last slide. So this is GDP and the Global Peace Index, and you can see the relationship between peace and economic development. The two are so inexplicably related. Now, that and Francis the end of the presentation. I didn't realise, Amanda, that was designed actually to run for an hour. Didn't realise that. Sorry about that, everyone. So anyway, a bit of time left for questions.
No, absolutely brilliant, Steve. And there's such a wealth of fantastic information in there. I love this. Never underestimate the power of hard work and obsessive thinking. It's great. And you should have a halo around your head, Steve, for this outstanding work. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and dive a bit deeper. Take the first question. Very interested in the US particularly, given that's where we are right now. And I was very interested to see that the US had the largest drop in positive peace since the inception of the Positive Peace Index. Now, you note that it's still number 24, so it's relatively high, but there's a very alarming trend. And when I look up the US on the Global Peace Index, it's 122 out of 163 nations. And you've also now categorized it as a flawed democracy rather than a full democracy. So I'd love it if you could comment on all of these rather frightening trends.
Okay. Well, okay. So the first thing is very, very big nations. None of them are highly peaceful. So you can think of your Chinas, you can think of your Russias, you can think of your Indias, you can think of your Brazils. Indonesia's not too bad. So what pulls the US down on the Global Peace Index is a whole range of things. So obviously it's got your high levels of the military, but it's a percentage of militarization, but as a percentage of GDP spent on the military, it's not necessarily high. It's above the world average, but it's not necessarily really high. It is, however, involved in a whole range of different conflicts around the world and has been. So its weapons are about as sophisticated as you get. So it's got a lot of nuclear weapons, so it scores poorly on that. So the ongoing conflict domain, as I've just already said, plenty of conflict. But if we look internally, there's a number of things which pull it down there. So if we look at it, you've got the so you've got high levels of gun ownership. You've got, for advanced democracies, you've got high levels of homicide. So we're looking at most of the developed world. You'll find that the homicide rates are under 1 per 100,000 people. US is about 4 per 100,000, 3 to 4 per 100,000 people from memory. So that's fairly high. So you've got very, very large number of people in jail, one of the larger populations in the world on a percentage basis. And so you've got a whole range of different statistics which pull the country down. And it's very, very hard for it to change that. Now, if we come back and look at positive peace. So the positive peace, as you quite rightly pointed out, is still high. So in the decade to 2020, it had the 6th largest fall in positive peace globally. But you've seen the same kind of, and I've skipped over the slide, but you've got a number of different things which are happening in most of the Western democracies. It's more accentuated in the US. So now, does this say what the future will be like? We don't know. Democracies do have the ability to be able to self-correct, which you don't get so much in authoritarian environments. So once you've got the power fully established in the hands of one group of elites, they tend to then, society tends to not advance very much at all. It doesn't have the ability to really adapt to change. That's one of the strengths democracies have. Now, is the US a flawed democracy? So in the world today, there's only 24 full democracies. And we use the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index to make these statements. They're not necessarily our own. So democracy is on the decline. And that's why I think positive peace, combined with systems thinking, does give us a vision through which we can look at how do we reinvigorate our Western democracies.
Thank you, Steve. I just love this very systematic approach that you've taken, because it means that people are able to unpack what is often a nebulous concept, as you point out in the book. I have a couple of very practical questions from Brian Masshard, who has a whole ton of students in Japan who would love to watch the webinar. And we are presuming that with your permission, we will be able to post this online and make sure that many audiences can see it. So we just wanted to get you on the record saying that was okay.
Yes, that's fine. But the other thing too is if anyone's interested in buying Peace in the Age of Chaos, you can buy it off any of the major websites. Just look Peace in the Age of Chaos up on the internet and you'll get there very, very quickly.
Awesome, thank you. And I know Brian says he teaches at a university in Japan and has a class on the survey of futures studies, and we'll be focusing on peace later this year. So thank you very much, Brian, for being with us at such an early hour and for making sure that your students can benefit too. Two other questions. One, Steve, are you able to share your slides? If people are asking us for copies of the slides, are you comfortable?
Yeah. Yeah, now you've got a copy of them, Amanda, and
Great.
Sure, that's fine. If they'd be using it in any presentations or anything like that, obviously refer back to the Institute for Economics and Peace. But the Institute for Economics and Peace is a not-for-profit organisation. It's a public good. Therefore, for the basic data and this kind of stuff, we're very, very happy for people to use it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think too, the other question was sources, and I know everything is so well documented in this brilliant book. So I would really recommend those of you who have questions about sources to refer to the book. Question on resilience. Resilience is a popular term right now. Why are so many of these negative things and trends so resilient? How can we make the positive trends more resilient and help them gain momentum? Great question.
I think it's, look, I was about to say the same thing too, Amanda. You stole my words. So, look, this comes back to the systems and like the concept of your homeostasis in systems. Systems are always trying to maintain a steady state. So, look, theories we've developed around systems and the way they operate largely started from biological systems. So we're all biological systems. And so an extension from that, societal systems are a byproduct of our biology in a way, or our consciousness, I guess. So that's the view we take. So what happens is that you've got to, so if you think of any system, and the system can, what it does can be good or bad. Okay, but they operate the same way. So what you've got is you've got a steady state. So if you've got entrenched corruption in the system, getting it out, it's really, really difficult. And so the encoded norms are within the systems which regulate it. So in this, it gets complicated. So what you really need to do is to understand the system, okay, the way the system operates. But to understand a system, you want to understand what is the question you're asking in the first place and what's the outcome you want. Otherwise, you can end up anywhere. It's just really too hard to say, oh, this is how a system operates. It's better to start with a question and understand the operation of the system from the perspective of that question. But one of the things which is really important is if you want to change a system, we'd use the 8 pillars of positive peace as a lens to be able to look through. And then what you want is you want things which stimulate the system from many, many different directions. In other words, you want a whole range of very, very small nudges to move the system in the direction you want it to go, rather than sort of come in, which we do. This is cause and effect thinking. Or rather, we come in with the one big thing, I'm going to fix. I'm going to fix the system. So we've got a housing crisis here in Australia. We've got an election coming up in 3 weeks. And both of the political parties come out with their one, I'm going to fix the housing crisis by doing this. And the reality is neither will actually fix the housing crisis because it's a combination of a myriad of different things. But what happens in a political election, this is cause and effect again. And this is built into it, our subconscious, through the understanding of the physics of cause and effect. That's why we can walk, why we can catch a ball. It's built in to our subconscious. And so it really takes energy and effort to think differently.
Thank you. And it is indeed complex. We all want a silver bullet, But the great benefit of the work that you have done and the indices is to really allow people to see into the workings of these, look at the correlations, including the economic correlations, which I think are so helpful and so often missing in peace work. We have a really interesting question, and I think this is the perfect place which to end. In aggregate, is Steve more optimistic or pessimistic about the next 50 years for the world? Very big question.
I get this one a lot. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. So it depends on the dimension you're looking at. So look, humanity's got a whole lot of major challenges it's facing as we move through the next 30 years. So look, in some ways, I'm reasonably confident on some of them, and it will depend where you're going to. So if I went to let's say the Sahel in Africa at the moment, I'm really pessimistic on where that's heading. Too many systemic problems, and that probably will flow into other parts of Africa. But so other things I'm really optimistic about. One of the African nations, I won't name it, but we're doing some training down there. The guy who's doing the training out of IEP is an ex-policeman. He used to run the organised crime division, the counter-terrorism division, and about 3,000 police and Victorian police. So very, very senior guy. He was with the guy who's heading up the police in the country, which in Africa will leave unnamed. And he said, look, this guy studied police studies. He was right about reforming the police, starting at the top and doing it all through training, and was just really keen to get our work in there. So at that level. Now, if we come back to climate change, I'm actually not too worried about climate change, unlike the rest of the planet. And that's because I think we've already got in place the mechanisms to solve the problem. Okay, I think the technology is coming through, and sort of we get another 20 years down the track, like it'll be a no-brainer, the economics of it all. No-brainer. And so I'm so on that one, I'm pretty keen on. Now, do other things worry me? Like, let's say, the acidification of the oceans. Like, yes, that really does. Things like the sustainability of the planet. And so if we look at it today, we looked at the biomass of all mammals on the planet. 60% of them are livestock, 36% is humans, and only 4% is other mammals. I didn't believe it at first, but it's true. These kind of things are worrying. We look at the impact we're having on the degradation and loss of the species. That really concerns me. Because what happens with evolution and evolutionary theory is you thin the species out, there's more opportunity for the adaptation and new species to arrive. This can come about with species which are really quite hostile to human beings. Think of an insect coming along which would just really love eating human flesh.
Yes, and there's a lot of
viruses.
Yeah, and when we look at, yes, I think there was a very interesting astrophysicist who said COVID-19 and the link to those kind of viruses is just a fire drill for what might be coming with climate change and the loss of species. So I'm very glad to hear that you're positive on climate and that there's work to be done on species. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think the positive note on which to end is that the systemic work that you have done, Steve, really provides guideposts, very positive guideposts. And your point about systems change means that every single one of us can do something to nudge the system in a positive direction. So I want to thank you so much on behalf of the Global Futures Lab, which aims to shape tomorrow today in a very positive way. And to finish with your quote, never underestimate the power of hard work and obsessive thinking. That's my takeaway for us all. Thank you.